Welcome to The Critique. So today we're looking at an editorial discussion about the political liabilities of figures like Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly and what that means for upcoming elections.
Right.
Okay, so what I really did like about this piece right off the bat is the focus on political foresight. It makes a really strong case for looking at the opposition's long game. And it brings in some compelling sources. You've got Abby Libby, Joel Berry, Dave Rubin, to build this whole theory about how Tucker is, being strategically managed by the left.
That part is fascinating. I mean, it immediately brings up these urgent questions about the power dynamics in the conservative media world and, how vulnerabilities around anti-Zionism could be exploited.
Exactly.
The insights are sharp, but they need to be delivered so clearly. I just wonder if we kind of rush past the main threat because we get bogged down in all the daily drama.
I think you just hit the core issue. The first thing we need to do is elevate the strategy by isolating that core political liability narrative.
Okay, so that's a powerful way to frame it. You're saying the central thesis, the idea that Tucker Carlson is being used as an electoral liability, it's getting seriously diluted by all these tangents about personality fights.
That is precisely it. The piece introduces this absolutely vital idea from sources like Insurrection Barbie and Joel Berry, this idea that the left is intentionally just letting him circle the drain.
Or sitting on his insane soundbites, right?
Yes, so they can deploy them later. The idea of hanging him around Vance's neck like an albatross in 2028, that is high-stakes political analysis.
It is. But then, right after establishing this, massive strategic threat for the party, the discussion just shifts.
Completely.
We're suddenly getting commentary on Tucker's, confusing White House appearance at some oil president meeting.
And the whole thumbnail controversy. Who really runs Florida with DeSantis and the Israeli prime minister?
Right. These jumps just diffuse the focus so quickly. The reader goes from thinking about a 4-year electoral game plan to what? Dissecting a weird photo op?
Yeah. So the suggestion here has to be structural. We need to dedicate distinct, really well-defined segments to the main political theories first.
Before you bring in the behavioral examples.
Exactly. Use the personality critiques as supporting evidence for why he's vulnerable.
Instead of treating them like they're equally important topics. But let me just push back a little. Isn't it tempting to jump to the gossip? It's immediate, it's juicy.
Oh, it is. But if the goal is foresight, the structure has to match the seriousness of the argument. Think of it this way. When you're talking about the Albatross strategy,
the idea that the opposition is planning how to use him to sink a 2028 campaign?
You have to immediately transition to the most serious corroboration you have.
I see. So you link it directly to Abby Libby's point that the left is betting the right doesn't have the moral strength and courage to excise this cancer.
Yes, that locks the reader in. It frames this whole thing not as some media spat, but as a deep moral and political weakness that is being deliberately exploited.
Okay, that makes sense. So then how do you use the White House attendance thing?
You frame it not as a confused side note like, why was he there?
Right.
But as a concrete behavioral example. It contradicts his whole anti-establishment brand, which just reinforces the argument that he's an unpredictable liability. He says one thing, but his actions signal something else entirely.
That's much tighter. Okay. And it shows his personal choices are strategically relevant.
And you have to keep the main strategic threat front and center, like that calculated risk that deadly attacks will happen on American soil so they can blame us. You have to maintain that severe, urgent analysis, not get lost in tangential stories.
Right. And that sort of brings me to the next point, which is about the language.
Moving on, we have to talk about the language used because while the strategic points are, very sophisticated, the tone can sometimes undermine the entire message.
Exactly. Building on that structural point, the tone is so critical. If the analysis is supposed to be authoritative, the language has to be just as robust and measured. Otherwise, it just sounds like yelling.
The core argument here is that the use of emotionally charged, dismissive, and frankly sometimes inflammatory language is distracting from the sophistication of the insights. It's diminishing the material's authority.
I completely agree. The piece really captures the urgency and frustration around the rise of anti-Zionism on the right, but then you get phrases like, It's so retarded.
Yeah, or, come on, oh my God, it's so retarded.
And sick burn, there idiots. It just introduces this level of juvenile reactivity.
And that kind of emotional register, it risks alienating readers who would otherwise agree with the fundamental strategic point that this behavior is bad news and needs to start at the top.
Right. You can keep the urgency without sacrificing the authority.
So the suggestion is to adopt a more analytically rigorous and measured tone. Use strategic or behavioral language to critique the absurdity of a situation.
Rather than just using these subjective, dismissive insults.
Let the strength of the argument do the work, not the intensity of the reaction.
So let's make that concrete. Take the Who Really Runs Florida thumbnail thing, where he's suggesting the Israeli prime minister is in charge, not the governor.
Okay.
Instead of that emotional reaction, the critique could just observe the logical inconsistency of it all.
Yeah, you could point out that if the state is spectacularly well run, which is a point the right generally agrees on, then suggesting the Israeli prime minister is doing it is a strategically incoherent attack on DeSantis.
Exactly. That makes the critique about strategy and logic, not personal outrage. It's way more precise and, frankly, more authoritative.
Okay, and what about the part on Megyn Kelly defending Candace Owens? Kelly says her job is to try to understand, yes, where Candace is coming from on this.
Right. To critique that posture, you shouldn't focus on the secondary reactions, like, what are you doing?
So what's the better way?
You should label Kelly's stance as the moral and logical absurdity that the piece hints at later on. It grounds the critique in a moral and logical framework. And when you're talking political strategy, those frameworks are just much more persuasive than, emotional pleas.
It's about maintaining that objective standard. Okay, so similarly, when describing Tucker's alleged lies about Ben Shapiro's comments on Maduro,
the part where he implies Shapiro never denounced Hamas, or that it was only about Israel?
Instead of an exclamation like, he never freaking said that, the action should be described as what? Factually contradicted?
Factually contradicted or misrepresented.
Yeah.
That maintains the high-level analysis the piece is going for. You can't sound like you're reading a textbook in one sentence and then sound like a Twitter reply in the next. The audience loses faith.
I think that gets at a bigger meta-narrative here, the why. Why are these figures behaving this way? And I think their career paths actually give us the perfect explanation for the tonal issues and the structural problems we just talked about.
That's a great pivot. I noticed that brilliant bit of sourcing, the Dave Rubin two-pager, which feels like the intellectual key to this entire behavioral critique.
A two-pager just meaning a sharp, concise argument.
Right. But it's summarized kind of separately from the rest of the analysis, and that just feels like a huge missed opportunity.
It is. So the point here is that perceptive analysis about Tucker and Megyn Kelly's origins in cutthroat mainstream media should be used as the foundational explanation for their current, perceived lack of authenticity and all the constant feuding.
So the weakness is that Rubin's theory, that Tucker and Kelly were basically banished from the mainstream world they wanted and are now just replicating that same culture of lies and ego online, isn't explicitly connected to their current failures.
Right. The piece focuses on their lying and the Israel-obsessed projection onto Ben Shapiro, but it doesn't tie that behavior back to the root cause, the failure of the old cable news mindset.
Where you can lie to your audience over and over.
But that doesn't work in the new online world that's supposedly built on trust and authenticity.
That's the missing link. And by not integrating that exile theory, you miss the chance to explain why their behavior is so predictable and therefore so easy for the opposition to weaponize. It feeds directly back into that Albatross strategy we started with.
So the suggestion is to weave this theory directly into the analysis of their current content failures. Present that mainstream media background as the driving force behind their strategic weakness. Show how their behavior is them just floating in the icy waters of conspiracy and clicks.
That makes the whole political point so much stronger. It adds depth.
How so?
Well, for example, you can connect the idea that they genuinely think they're better than everyone else because of their names to the audience's disappointment, to that feeling of, this is not what I started listening to you for. It shows that real-world erosion of trust.
And this exile theory perfectly explains why their behavior, the little lies, the backstabbing, makes them such easy targets for the Albatross strategy.
Because they're just performing the same predictable, ego-driven moves they learned in cable news.
Right, but in an environment where people will wisen up and find better choices, Their old habits have become their biggest strategic weakness.
This also highlights an internal vulnerability for the right that the opposition they'll absolutely exploit it. The critique mentions that these figures have chosen to spit in the faces of the new media people who they think they're better than.
That's such a critical point to amplify. That internal division is exactly what makes the effort to, forcefully remove this liability so difficult for the conservative movement.
It's a failure of internal leadership driven by ego.
Which is exactly what the mainstream exile theory explains. So integrating that, why just makes the entire piece so much more robust and insightful?
Yeah, I think that integration is what will take this piece from just a critique of a few personalities to a really high-level strategic warning about media and politics today.
So we covered some really high-impact opportunities today. First, tightening the structure around that compelling 2028 strategic risk.
Defining what's a primary argument and what's supporting evidence.
Right. Second, moderating the reactive language to make sure the tone matches the seriousness and increases that analytical authority. And finally, better integrating the theory about mainstream media exiles.
To provide that behavioral foundation for why they're political liabilities.
Exactly.
So the action items are really about structural reorganization and tone calibration. Use the big strategic points, like the Albatross analogy, as the main frame, and then let the observations on ego and authenticity serve as that powerful explanatory layer underneath.
And that will transform the discussion into the focused, high-level analysis it was clearly meant to be.
Absolutely.
Thank you for submitting this sharp material. We look forward to seeing the next draft and continuing this discussion on the critique.